For a sociologist, the study of religion is really looking at the organization and the unified system of beliefs and practices that is relative to sacred things, and not just the organization of one, but of many, right? That there are many of these belief systems that have become organized and formalized, sometimes to the point of being bureaucratic. And so we're going to be examining how people construct religion and also how religion impacts us and society. So while this may not be covered in your text, I just think it's kind of like a service to clarify that religiosity and spirituality are two different things. Religiosity is the level of adherence, right, to practices, to fundamentals, even of a religious system, right? And so it goes beyond just belief, but also into like how frequently do you attend some sort of organized system? How frequently do you participate in rituals or practices related to that system, right? And just kind of like how fervently do you follow these rules and norms and adopt the values of a religious system? Spirituality, in and of itself, is about having a belief in the sacred and maybe a connection to the sacred. It doesn't really have that same formality necessarily as religiosity. Okay. So you can't use the measures of religiosity to actually measure spirituality, right? It's not a valid, connection because these are two different constructs. When we're talking about religiosity or spirituality, just religion in general, we often talk about this through the lens of what is profane and what is sacred. Because the sacred is really the focus of religion, right? Sacred means that, these are elements that go beyond our everyday life, right? These are things that we view as being um, supernatural or as being, worthy of inspiration, of awe, of respect, of fear. And typically, sacred elements involve some amount of faith, some level of believing and accepting something that you cannot understand or that you cannot see. Okay. Profane, I know we've been taught that profane is like the word profanity, where you're talking about curse words and things like that. And that is not the um, most basic understanding of that term. Profane simply means that something is ordinary or commonplace, right? So, for example, books and Bibles, books like everyday books, like your textbook or a Bible or a religious text, can be printed on the same paper in the same paper mill, but the meanings that we attach to them are typically, respectively, profane and sacred, right? And so a textbook, I might just pile it up somewhere in a corner or throw it on the floor of my car. But a religious text, if I am a religious person, I would probably treat with a bit more respect, right? A bit more fear or awe. I'm not just going to throw it on the ground and stomp on it when I get mad. There's this idea that when it comes to religion, that we are growing increasingly secularized as a society and globally. And I don't think that that is true overall. There are still a lot of people who are affiliated with religion or with a particular religion, and a lot of people who, even if they're not affiliated, who have um, religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, right? Or spiritual practices. But there is a trend towards explaining things without necessarily a religious frame, because we often use religious framing to explain things we didn't understand. And with increased science and the ability to observe phenomena, we don't have to make those explanations using religion anymore. And so it's really interesting to think about, and it's really challenging to think about as well, right? Like, how do we explain how women become pregnant? That has changed over time. How do we explain why people are poor or why people are sick? that used to be a question that was explained using concepts like evil or wickedness or sin, as the catalysts for this, these like people falling on hard times and things like that, right? On these elements and on these bad luck situations. And so there is that trend towards using observable phenomena to explain things versus not. So, yeah. And also, there's a move towards people being free to find those explanations elsewhere as well. So, when sociologists talk about religion, we often talk about like these different classifications of religions, right? And that's one of the ways we organize our study of religion. So, at the most basic level, we look at like the source of the belief system, the supernatural source in particular. So you have polytheism, which means that there are multiple gods. There's more than one God. There's monotheism, where the focus is on mono or one single God. There's atheism, where there is no deity, right? And where basically people are kind of focused on humanity, right? And the example of atheism, I think it's funny. It's atheism. And people always say, like, well, doesn't that mean that it's not a religious belief system? And so we kind of explain it. It's kind of a cop out explanation. But by saying that because we're believing in humans, or because we're saying that there is no deity, then we would say that atheists, are practicing a belief that there's no deity. There's agnosticism as well, where people actually believe that there may be a deity, or they do believe that there is a deity, but they are not a part of a major religious system, and they do not believe necessarily that one religion is better than another, right? So agnostics can be polytheistic, they can be monotheistic, whatever. Some other examples here that show up actually are focused less on a deity and instead looking at morality, and looking at more like cause and effect and karma, like looking at Buddhism and Taoism. You have the focuses of like animism, looking at non-human beings, and this is really popular with Shinto practices. And usually, if you look at Japan, for example, a lot of the physical manifestation of religion there is Shinto, but the Buddhism is kind of the lifestyle type religion there. And then you have some totemism and things like that, which are focusing more so on human natural being connection. And so connecting people to some form of nature, right? And creating kind of a totem for that person from that natural being or element of nature. So, when it comes to the components of religion, like how we determine how a religion is a religion, or basically the expression of religion, what are those patterns of religious behavior? We look at three things, and I actually have them on here backwards. The first is belief. So, belief would be something like a statement to which members of a particular religion adhere, right? And so there could be some commandments or some rules or some tenets or an eightfold path that you follow or whatever, right? What are those statements that people who are following that religion believe, and how deeply, how intensely do they believe them? Because with some, they believe that, the statements are literal, right? And that the interpretation is exactly what it says. And so, for example, with fundamentalism, right, this is an emphasis on doctrinal conformity, right? There is one interpretation and everyone should have that same interpretation. And that interpretation is literal interpretation. So if God says an eye for an eye, then that means people need to be losing eyes. Okay. If God says don't mix fabrics, right, that is a sin, then that means you don't mix the fabrics. Okay. with a ritual, this is another expression of religion, and these are the practices that are either required or expected by members of a faith. So they typically serve the purpose of honoring a divine power, of affirming beliefs, or not following them or not doing them could have sanctions that are attached to them. And so you might like literally need to say some Hail Marys, right? Or you might need to go and get baptized because you have like broken some rule. Or you might be thrown out of the church, or maybe you won't gain entrance into some like pretty cool afterlife space. I don't know. But yeah, these rituals can, they can vary in importance and intensity. And then finally, we have experience, which refers to the feeling or perception of being in direct contact with the ultimate reality, with whatever supreme being or deity, right? So, like a divine being or becoming overcome with religious emotion. If you've ever been to a Black church, you're probably familiar with this idea of experience, right? And it's in particular the idea of effervescence, right? You're overcome, right, with spiritual emotion, basically. And so you'll see people who, like, they have been described as, through Christianity and the Black church in particular, catching the spirit, right, or catching the Holy Ghost. They're dancing, they're rolling around, they're speaking in tongues, right? They're doing all of the things, right? And that is an expression of religion as well. I think it's pretty easy to tell which one's the easiest to measure. People can easily tell you how they interpret a religious text. They can tell you how much they conform or believe they should be conforming to religious doctrine. Similarly, they can tell you the frequency of participation in religious rituals. Experience is the one that's hard, because how do you compare one person's perceived, very personal religious experience to another's? And also, how do you check for validity with that? Because that's something that is the self-reporting when it comes to experience can be a little less trusting, because some people believe that in order to look like they're a good whichever religion like adherent, um, that they are supposed to be having those experiences, so they're going to be more likely to lie and say that they are, even if they're not. So yeah, these are some components, right? So if you start Googling, like go to Pew Research Center, you can go to Gallup poll, or look at the General Social Survey in the United States, and you can get a lot of this data about how many Americans report back on rituals, beliefs, and experiences. Also, where I went to graduate school, Baylor University is a Southern Baptist Christian school. It's a good school, just very Christian. They actually have one of the most like popular, impressive surveys through the Sociology of Religion program about religious beliefs and even paranormal beliefs as well, which aren't necessarily that far from religious beliefs and their character. So yeah. Another factor that we study when it comes to religious organizations are the size and the magnitude and influence of those organizations. And that starts from ecclesia, which are religious organizations that claim to include most or all members of a society and are also recognized as the national or official religion. So in many Muslim nations, if you are a citizen of that nation, that means you are also Muslim, right? It goes hand in hand. Your nationality is also linked to your actual religious practice. For denominations, this is where it's similar to ecclesia. It's large, it's organized, but it's not officially linked to the state or government. And the United States has a perfect example of that with Christianity. Christianity is influential throughout our social institutions, but it's not an official religion. Not all Americans are born Christians. And then you have something called a sect. And this is a relatively small religious group compared to denominations and ecclesia. And typically they are related to those denominations and ecclesia. They've just broken away from some other religious organization to renew often what they consider to be the original vision of the faith or the correct vision of the faith. And then my favorites to study: sects are cool, but cults and or they're not always the same. New religious movements, or NRMs, are so fun. They are small, often secretive religious groups that represent either a new religion or a major innovation of an existing faith, right? And so there's a difference between a cult and a new religious movement. Not every new religious movement becomes a cult. Cults usually tend to isolate their members. They tend to have control over many aspects of their members' lives. They become total institutions. And they typically are taking advantage of people who are disenfranchised or who are looking for something different. And so, no offense, but college students, and especially young college students, are particularly at risk of being recruited into a cult. And we're starting to see cults that are popping up out of like business ventures now. It's not just coming out of like philosophical, self-help areas anymore. But now it's becoming like a business kind of recruitment kind of thing as well. So they're fun to look at. They're also frightening. So yeah. Fun fact: I was actually raised in a religious sect, not a cult, of Buddhism. So that's again a story for another day. I actually have a little case study that I used once for an assignment in my intro to sociology class overseas, that I can share, that tells basically the story of the sect that I was involved in. But yeah, it was a sect of Buddhism in the United States, and it's not small. It's small compared to Buddhism overall, in its normal expressions, but it's not. It's not super dramatic, like like cults like Jonestown and the People's Temple or Scientology, which is more of a sect now, believe it or not. But it did have some scandal involved. So yeah. Surely you didn't think we were going to make it through this discussion of religion without bringing up our friends, the theoretical perspectives of sociology. So when it comes to um, religion and its functions, we view it as being an integrative force in human society. It gives meaning and purpose. It gives us values and ends to hold on to. It gives us something common to share with one another. And one of the ways that it can be integrative in our societies is quite practical. People who are outsiders coming into a community, like immigrants, for example, or people who are marginalized, can integrate into either, communities or into a new homeland or whatever via religious organizations. You'll notice that often religious organizations offer a lot of social services, right? And it's not just because they're supposed to be nice and love on everyone, but because that is a really practical way to gain new membership as well. Religion can provide social support. It can allow us to do something about the calamities that we face. It can offer us a way to, in a tangible way, do some problem solving. And so we could offer sacrifices, we could pray, we could read a text, but in the face of things that you can't do anything else about, it gives you something to do. And it also can encourage us to view personal misfortunes as relatively unimportant in the broader perspective of human history. Like if you're looking at religious stories or mythical tales and things like that, it kind of makes a lot of our everyday human troubles today look kind of unimportant. Religion can also be a force for social change. We can look at how our society changes with religion. So, for example, with Protestantism rising, we saw that the Protestant work ethic, right? The idea that you're going to be rewarded in your afterlife. So don't worry about your poverty here on earth, right? Don't worry about your wealth. Just focus so much more on working really hard now so that you can be rewarded later. Guess what other ideology that really works in line with and supports? Capitalism, right? So much so that an amazing sociologist and author, Max Weber, wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and talked about how capitalism really was able to thrive and grow because of the rise of Protestantism at the same time. So religion isn't just about intimate personal beliefs, it's also about, these collectives that have consequences for society, right, as a whole. With that social change, we also talk about something called liberation theology, and that's where the church, right, or religious organizations can be used in political efforts. And sometimes these are wonderful. So, like eliminating poverty, or fighting against like oppression of some sort or inequalities. It can also be problematic, however, on some stances where you find religious organizations protesting things that have nothing to do with religion because they think it is all their purview, right? Um, and so a lot of this, regardless of whether it's something that seems a bit less negatively impacting of people or not, is really stoked and fostered by a belief that organized religion has a responsibility, right, to have a public stance about things, to stand against oppression, right, and things like that, or also to stand against what they believe to be demonic or like secularized interferences, right, of progress and change. So yeah. So when it comes to religion and social control, for Durkheim, religion, actually one of the functions of religion is social control. And so you can look at that from a functionalist perspective, that religion provides us like a moral compass and things like that. But for others, that social control they thought wasn't helpful, right? And they were very much displeased with that social control because it was typically very conservative and very traditional in nature. So according to Marx actually gets a really bad rep when it comes to talking about religion, because he does mention that it is pacifying. And he does have that quote, right, where he said that religion is the opiate of the masses, but it's often used out of context. He thought that religion had the potential of impeding on social change if it encouraged the oppressed to focus on other worldly concerns rather than on their poverty or exploitation. And so, in some way, if you think about this opiate effect, if you are in pain or if you are struggling, religion can offer some pacification of that pain and of that struggle, right? And maybe make it a bit more tolerable. And that's not necessarily what he's saying is negative, right? Because he also says that it is the like collective sigh of the oppressed, right? That people who are oppressed, like they seek out religion and it's like a space where they can find comfort and solace. But he also is saying that if you're only focusing on the afterlife and on these other worldly concerns, rather than also fighting against exploitation, right? And fighting for justice here on earth, then he didn't really love it. Okay. So, yeah, did he have some criticism of religion? Yes. But was it fully like religion bad? Don't do. You're a robot on drugs? Not necessarily. Um, so, I mean, for the most part, most people view religion as being a source of support rather than adversity, right? However, there's some discouraging like roots in that. And that in 2010, for example, 95% of people in the poorest nations felt that religion was important to daily life. However, in the wealthiest countries, this was only true for 47%, right? And so that kind of speaks to what Marx was trying to say there, that for people who are poor, religion becomes even more important because it's a way of coping with their pain and struggle. And that for people who aren't poor, they don't see the need right? It's pretty rough.